All right, this is going to show you the process of taking a model that you've created in Vectorworks or other software and scaling it down and exporting it as an STL file to open in Cura, which is a slicing software, basically a software that prepares files for 3D printing, and then exporting it onto an SD card and printing it, in our case, on a Monoprice Mini. And we're trying to print a full-sized object in quarter-inch or half-inch scale to go into a theatrical scenic model. So what we're doing is we're taking a big thing, making it smaller, and then printing it in that small size. So I'm going to use Vectorworks in here because I think for two reasons. One, there's a couple little shortcuts in Vectorworks that's really easy when you're taking big things and making them smaller, but then also you're also probably modeling in Vectorworks already to create your drafting or to create your 3D renderings or whatever. So you can cut and paste out of stuff you've already made into a new file. And I recommend that. I recommend doing it in a blank document. So the process for this is modeling it in whatever software you want to use. And I'm not going to cover that part right now. I'm going to assume that you have your little table or whatever ready to go. You can use SketchUp or Blender or whatever, but using Vectorworks, as I've mentioned, is a shortcut in some ways. And there's also a real shortcut to step 2 here, which is scaling it down to fit your desired print scale. But if you're not using Vectorworks, that's what these two little numbers over here are. That's a quarter-inch and half-inch are the two model scales that we use most often in theater. And this is the scaling factor that you're going to need. What this number is how many times smaller that the model needs to be shrunk. Now, quarter inch is 48 times smaller than full scale, and half inch is 24 times smaller than full scale. And if you remember, if you forget those, there's a little cheat sheet you can use here on the layer scale here in Vectorworks. You can see the paper scale here is 1:1. I'm in full scale right now, so it's 1:1. But if we click over here to quarter inch, you can see that, 1:48, or half inch is 1:24. Or maybe sometime you decide you want to print something in 3/8 inch scale and you don't know what that factor is. Well, it's 1:32. So you can just figure out what the factor is right here and get that number. And then all this number is dividing the bigger number into 1 to get this number. So don't type in, when you're shrinking something down, if you say, I want to make it 48 times smaller, so I'm going to type in 48. Well, all it's going to do is make it slightly 48% smaller. It's going to make it slightly smaller than half size. That's not what you want. You need to put in this number. It's going to start with a 0.0 because we're taking something really big and we're making it really tiny. That also goes to talking about how you want to model something. So for example, I have this stack of tables right here. You notice that I'm printing them upside down because, if you're not done any 3D printing, one of the things that we need to be aware of is overhang. So if this table was right side up, so if this was the bottom and this was upside down here, then all of that tabletop would be drooping or maybe just fall all the way down to the ground as it was printing because the hot plastic is coming out of the nozzle. Now, overhang is an issue, but I've printed this file a couple of times now with these little tables. We have to remember how tiny things are in quarter inch or even in half inch scale. So these legs hanging out over here seem like a huge overhang, but this is going to be actually in actual scale, that's going to be like a quarter of an inch. It's really tiny. So this is the one we're going to do, this one here in the middle. This is a 4-foot diameter tabletop in quarter inch scale, which means this tabletop is going to be an inch. It's going to be the size of a nickel. So it's going to be this very small piece of plastic down over here, which means this little overhang here is less than a quarter of an inch. So you can actually get away with a lot more overhang in tiny little parts than you could if this were much bigger parts. The other thing that to be aware of is that there is a function in Cura that you may be tempted to click on, so the auto supports. When you do have a lot of undercut areas or overhanging areas, you can just check this little button in Cura. I'll show you where it is, and it will automatically put in all this kind of zigzag plastic in there to help keep things from dripping down. The problem with that is in these tiny little models is, one, you don't actually need it, like these don't need it, and it's going to make your print a lot longer because it's got to print all the supports, and it's going to use more filament. That's not too big of a deal. But the biggest problem with it is that you need to get rid of that. Then you're going to spend like half an hour with an X-Acto blade carefully cutting away all those supports. And it's almost impossible with teeny, delicate little parts like this to not end up breaking part of your model while you're trying to get the dang supports off. So I don't recommend using that for tiny little parts like scale parts. If you do have significant overhang, I think it's just better in Vectorworks just to come in and make a little rectangle and extrude it up, to hold up some points. Oftentimes you don't need that for tiny little overhangs. Like I print chairs normally right side up. Just print the 4 little legs and then the cross pieces and then the seat and the back. It can print them standing in the normal position without any problem because the little quarter-inch chair is like a tiny little bit of overhang. It can actually handle that. There may be a few little wires kind of dripping down that you need to clip off, but you can get away with a lot of overhang. The other thing to be aware of when you're taking something and making it a tiny scale is that you may be able to take the model that you made of a table and just do this little scaling trick I'm going to show you here in a second and shrink it down, but then it's going to end up with these parts being too delicate. So the printer can only print a certain thickness based on the nozzle head and the print resolution that you're using. And I think it's different for different sizes of things. I haven't quite figured out what the magic number is in scale, but you can print something that's too slender for the printer to register. So imagine a chair with like a slat back to it. So you're trying to print a little chair and it has little slender little legs and it has slender little backs on that. And you take it, maybe they're, 2 inch by half an inch or something like that in real world scale. Well, when you shrink it down, it actually makes those objects more thin than the printer can actually print. It's like, think about printing up something thinner than a pixel on paper. It can't print less than 1 pixel, so it's going to have to not print it at all. So that's what happens is you'll end up with a chair with no legs and no back and just a seat, that it's probably a little pile of goo because it was printing that seat in midair because it just can't print those tiny little slender things. And I discovered that actually by trying to do two slender supports on things like this, and then it would come off of the print without the supports because I made them too small. But the thing I was trying to support was just fine. So that's why I realized you can actually get away with more overhang than you might think at first. The other really good news is that if you screw it up, these parts are so tiny, they print in 10, 15 minutes. And so it doesn't take long to know that you messed it up. It's like, whoops, I got all this drippiness here. I'm going to have to make that thicker or whatever. Reprinting something when it takes 10 minutes is a lot easier than when it takes 10 hours. So just be aware when you're shrinking stuff down that you aren't making it so skinny that it can't even be seen. So what you may have to do is go into a model after you shrunk it down and beef stuff up. Like the round vertical support there and that is actually kind of chunky. That's probably 5 inches or something in diameter. And maybe it's 2 inches in the real table that you're trying to model. And yet that 2 inches is too small to print. So you're going to end up, or it's going to be so fragile. It's going to be this tiny little slender wire of plastic that's just going to snap right off when you try to put it into your model. So things just need to be a bit chunkier in the tiny scale just to survive the printing process. Okay, so here's that process. That's a good place to stop, and we'll pick up the second tutorial here with the actual process of prepping this for printing.